Have you been told that you need to stop eating red meat to improve your LDL cholesterol? This is advice that's given out a lot of times when individuals go to get their cholesterol checked and they find that they have slightly elevated LDL levels. Now, honestly, this isn't advice that I would give out myself. As a dietitian, if I'm looking at your LDL cholesterol, I'm definitely not going to recommend or tell you that you have to cut out all red meat or go on a completely vegan or vegetarian diet. This honestly is pretty outdated advice. And today we're going to talk about what LDL cholesterol is and what you can actually do in order to decrease your cardiovascular risk. I'm Susan Lopez, and this is the Tactical Nutrition and Performance Podcast, where we help tactical athletes bridge the gap between nutrition, metabolism, sleep, stress, and training so they can perform better and live longer. Now, if you're tuning into this podcast, it's very likely that the title of it piqued your interest. And this is because it's really common for individuals to be told, especially in the tactical community, that they need to improve their LDL cholesterol levels. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about today what LDL cholesterol really is and what you actually need to do with your nutrition and some lifestyle things to actually improve it. And we're going to talk about other measures that you can look at to actually determine what your cardiovascular risk is. Now, it's not uncommon, like I said, for tactical athletes to have slightly elevated LDL-C levels or low density lipoprotein cholesterol levels. But what does this really mean? Your LDL cholesterol is a measurement of a particular type of lipoprotein or fat and protein molecule that actually transports cholesterol around. LDL often gets a rap for being the bad type of cholesterol, but the reality is that it's not all bad. When you go to get your levels checked at the doctor, usually what they're going to tell you is they want to see this LDL cholesterol level below 100. Under 100 is considered optimal. 100 to about 129 is considered near optimal, and anything over 130 is going to be considered borderline high or high. Now, that might run a little contrary to what you've heard before, but these are typically the parameters that I'm going to use to assess if somebody's LDL cholesterol is really elevated or not. I will tell you that most of the docs that I work with within the tactical community aren't really even going to bat an eye if your LDL cholesterol is 100 to 130. The LDL-C that you're getting checked at your doctor's office, it's not really a measurement of how many LDL particles you have. That's a completely separate measurement. That's known as LDL-P or LDL particle. And when we look at LDL particle, we are looking at a couple of different things. We're looking at the number of actual LDL particles you have. We're looking at what size those particles are. So are they small and dense? Are they medium? Are they large and buoyant? The ones that we worry about are going to be those small, dense LDL particles because those tend to be the most damaging to the arterial wall. The other thing we want to look at is our HDL levels, or high density lipoprotein levels. Your HDL-C, this is a carrier that's actually going to take some of that LDL and transport it to the liver to be cleared from the body. So this is why HDL is frequently known as your good cholesterol. And why, when we're assessing your HDL and LDL levels, we want to compare the ratio of LDL-C to HDL-C if that's what you're getting checked. And ideally, that ratio should be less than 2. So for instance, if your LDL-C is 130, then ideally we want that HDL ratio to be somewhere between 60 and 70 to lower that risk. LDL by itself isn't necessarily considered a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, even though it's still very common for people to be put on medication for elevated LDL levels. What recently a study came out actually indicating that higher levels of LDL in healthy males over the age of 61 might actually be associated with them living longer. There also may be some benefits with higher LDL levels in terms of cognitive function as you age. So what that really tells us is that we really don't know everything. We don't know everything that there is to know about LDL cholesterol. And we really want to be careful with blanketing recommendations when we're not even getting a full picture of what our cardiovascular risk is. Typically, what I'm going to recommend is that you ask your doctor if you can also get your LDL particle levels checked. We also want to look at triglyceride levels. You have a large amount of those small, dense LDL particles and you have elevated triglycerides. That's where our risk factors really start to add up. Additionally, you can ask for things like your lipo-A and your ApoB, which at some point we'll probably go a little bit more into depth on. But these are also lipoprotein measurements that we can look at to, again, get that full picture of what's actually going on with our heart health. When we're looking at our triglycerides, it's important to understand that it has a much closer relationship to our carbohydrate intake and to excessive sugar intake, particularly in the absence of physical activity. Remember that sugar and carbs are going to be necessary in order for you to express energy, especially during moderate to high intensity exercise. Whenever we're participating in events that have a huge cognitive demand, glucose from carbohydrates and sugars is going to be that primary fuel source. So we don't want to eliminate those. But when we're consuming excessive amounts in the absence of physical activity, or we're taking in excessive amounts of alcohol, this is where our triglyceride levels can actually become elevated. That excess glucose is actually going to be converted to triglycerides, and this is where we can get into a situation where now that small, dense LDL particle has done damage to the lining of the arterial wall. And now we're going to see where you have these lipoproteins, where you have these triglycerides getting stuck in there and causing the narrowing of the artery potentially. And in the liver, an excessive amount of triglycerides can also accumulate. And now we're going to see things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which has its own set of problems. And there is this tight relationship between dysregulated blood sugar levels and cardiovascular disease. In a lot of cases, if you're dealing with blood sugar levels that are not controlled and you do end up with a diagnosis of diabetes, one of the things to remember is that the disease process from diabetes to cardiovascular disease, it's a cascade. The majority of people who have diabetes are not going to die from diabetes. They're actually going to die from heart disease. Around 80% of people who have diabetes actually end up with cardiovascular disease. So it's really important that we understand that it's not just a singular thing or a singular picture that's going to increase that disease risk. But you really need to figure out, okay, what is my genetic risk factors here? What are some modifiable things that I can do? If I have an elevated level of LDL cholesterol, what does my LDL particles look like? And do I have a lot of the small dense ones, or do I have a lot of the large fluffy ones that don't really do a lot of damage? Because not all LDL particles are quote unquote bad for you. So what are some things we can do with our nutrition to actually help with our cholesterol levels besides just cutting out red meat and eggs? These seem to be the two most common foods that people are still being told to eliminate from their diet, even though we know that dietary cholesterol doesn't do much to affect your serum cholesterol, assuming that you're an active, healthy individual. So some things that we already know are going to be beneficial are going to be to make sure that you're getting adequate fiber throughout the day. This fiber is going to be helping to carry some of that LDL cholesterol out of the body. Some of this fiber is going to be helping to balance out blood sugar levels so that we're not producing as many triglycerides, hopefully. Physical activity is also going to be a huge component in ensuring that you are not storing up a lot of glucose as triglycerides. So the foods that I typically recommend to increase your fiber intake are going to be most commonly your vegetables and your fruits, and then whole grains as needed. And if you've listened to any of my other videos, or you're someone who's in our coaching program, you know that carbohydrate intake can vary based on your goals, based on your training cycle, based on the volume of training that you're doing, and based on the amount of times that you're working out throughout the day, when you work out throughout the day. That can vary just based on where you're at in your training program. So we want to take that into consideration. Most of the time when we're consuming a lot of vegetables, even though some of them contain higher amounts of carbohydrates, you're also going to get a significant amount of fiber with those. And so we don't want to skip that piece. Typically, your vegetable and fruit intake is going to be one of the most important things. Another compound to take into consideration is going to be your intake of something known as phytosterols. Another case here for a high vegetable intake. Plant-based phytosterols are antioxidants that can help actually lower your LDL cholesterol and also have an effect on your small, dense LDL particles. Foods that are going to be high in phytosterol content are going to be things like peas, nuts and seeds, macadamia nuts, pumpkin seeds, safflowers, oranges, macadamia nuts. Kidney beans are also high in phyto. When we look at things that have a benefit in terms of your total cholesterol levels, your triglycerides, your B, we have found a huge benefit. There has been a huge benefit found to consuming things like strawberries, red yeast rice supplements, and also berberine supplementation. So the big takeaways from today are going to be: one, see a dietitian if you have concerns about your cholesterol levels. If you're getting blanket recommendations to remove things like red meat or eggs from your diet without also getting recommendations on what you should be adding to your diet, nutrition, and supplementation routine, then that's going to be a little bit of a red flag. Ask for deeper lab testing. Ask for your LDL particle numbers. Ask for your ApoB, your Lipo-A, so that you actually have that full picture of risk. If you're having difficult time getting access to those labs, this is something that we do provide within our coaching community and with our one-on-one coaching services. So feel free to reach out to see how you can get started with our coaching program. You can also head over to www.tacticaldietitian.com/store to check out all of our options for coaching. And we also have a ton of free resources over there around nutrition, calories, performance, anything that you can probably think of that you would need help with. So let me know in the comments below if you have ever been given this recommendation and what you think about it now that we've talked about it. I want to hear what you guys have to say, and we'll see you on the next episode.